Welcome to Truthout Radio for another week. I'm your host, Ted Asregadoo. Syndicated talk show host Thom Hartmann is my guest this week, and he is also a contributor to Truthout. In fact, his piece he wrote on January 15th entitled "The Second Amendment Was Ratified to Preserve Slavery" has been one of the most widely read articles on Truthout this month. Hello, Thom. Welcome to Truthout Radio.
Hey, Ted. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you.
Great. I'm really excited to talk to you about the article that you wrote about why some of us here in the United States are essentially addicted to guns. Now, you cite in your piece a 1998 article by a professor at Roger Williams School of Law. His name is Carl T. Bogus. It's about how the Second Amendment is more about subduing slave insurrections than an individual's right to bear arms. Now, how is this the case?
Well, there's actually three pieces to it, and I didn't so much get into it in the article because the first piece I think I've dealt with in other places, and it's more conventional wisdom, but it bears repeating. The main reason why the Second Amendment was first drafted was in 1787. In November of 1787, Thomas Jefferson was living in Paris. James Madison had just finished putting together the Constitution. He sent a copy of it off to Jefferson. Jefferson was his mentor, and he also was arguably one of the most powerful men in Virginia, and even though he was in Paris. And Jefferson sends Madison back a letter saying, I love this idea of three parts of government and the executive having a veto and this, and you've dealt with the small state, big state, and the slavery-free stuff, and the Three-Fifths Compromise, and all these things, and this all looks like it can work. And now I will tell you what I do not like. And he said, what I do not like is that there is not a Bill of Rights that specifically and without ambiguity lays out, and he goes through a list of, as I recall, 5 or 6 things. One of them was no monopolies in commerce, which ultimately didn't make it into the Bill of Rights. Unremitting habeas corpus, the absolute right of habeas corpus, and no standing armies. And repeatedly, you find many of the founders were absolutely opposed to standing armies during times of peace. They had seen over and over and over again in the history of America, or in the history of Europe rather, and other countries around the world, nations overthrown by their militaries. And this is why the other protection, in addition to the ban on standing armies in the Second Amendment, or that was the original goal of it, was also in Article 1, Section 8, where they said that you cannot appropriate funds for more than 2 years for the Army. You can appropriate funds for 50, 100 years for anything, absolutely anything, except the Army. The Army has to be revisited every 2 years because there was so much opposition to there being a standing army during times of peace. So what do you have if you don't have a standing army? You must have militias, state militias. This is essentially what Switzerland has. That was the model that they wanted to have. And that those militias would be regulated at the local level, then at the state level, and then ultimately when the Constitution was put into place, because the militias were largely already there under the Articles of Confederation, and arguably even prior to that in the Revolutionary War, that those militias would fall under the auspices of the President. Under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, he would have authority over them. So that was really the main reason that it started out in there. But then when they got into the ratifying convention in Virginia, 8 states had ratified the convention, had ratified the Constitution. If Virginia didn't ratify, then there was going to be a huge problem. I mean, it was one of the biggest states. It was right in the middle between the northern and the southern states. It was the home of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Madison and Patrick Henry and George Mason and all these guys who were so powerful and influential. And there was concerns, a very real concern, that if Virginia said no to this, it might go down in flames. And so at that ratifying convention, Patrick Henry gets up, who was a slaveholder, and although he gave lip service to hating slavery, and he says, but Article 1, Section 8 says that the militias will be armed by Congress and the President. Well, if they're armed, that means that the states don't have the authority to control how well they're armed. And in fact, the federal government could say, you may have 1 gun for every 1,000 soldiers. And if they were to functionally, therefore, disarm the militia of the state of Virginia, the militia was one of the major tools that was used by the state to maintain the institution of slavery. And so James Madison changed his second draft of the Second Amendment from in order to maintain a free country to in order to maintain a free state.
Now, the interesting thing that you, well, there was a lot that you mentioned that was interesting, but Patrick Henry comes to mind, obviously, give me liberty or give me death. There was a book by David Hackett Fisher that came out in the late 80s, early 90s called Albion Seed. And it was about how the British immigration to the United States also imported some folkways. It's a social history, a cultural history, but it's a synthesis. And he talks a little bit about freedom and the different types of freedom that existed in the American colonies. Now, you talked about Patrick Henry, and one of the types of freedom that David Hackett Fisher talks about is a hegemonic freedom, and that's this freedom to rule but not be ruled by others. So when Patrick Henry talks a lot about freedom but says, oh, but, and puts that little caveat in there, it reminds me of what Hackett Fisher was talking about in his book. And in fact, he does reference Patrick Henry in his book, but it's a different type of freedom, another one called natural freedom, which was this distrust of centralized government and even deviance, social deviance. If anybody deviated from what they considered the norm, it was sort of a wrong and could be met by the barrel of a gun or some sort of violent end. And it comes down to when I was reading this book and listening to you talk, I'm thinking about this sort of cultural DNA that David Hackett Fisher talked about. You alluded to in your previous comments, and it seems like this sort of distrust of outsiders, this distrust of central authority, is something that's embedded in this country's DNA. You have any comment on that?
Yeah, a couple. First of all, the first colony in the United States was Jamestown, which was a company town in 1607. This was the largest transnational corporation in the world set it up. The British East India Company was named after the king, King James. They named the state after the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth, Virginia. And, Jamestown had its problems, and we don't need to go through the whole history. But the second major settlement of the United States was after these crazy religious right-wingers had tried to overthrow the British government, had successfully actually overthrown the king. And, Cromwell came to power, and for 7 years, as I recall, forbid dancing and singing. And, the Puritans had their time, and the British people said, screw this, we want the king back, and, our booze and our songs. And they threw him out. And so those Puritans came to Massachusetts and set up shop, and right up until the time of arguably the ratification of the American Constitution, they were persecuting women and witches. In fact, they did that. Arguably, they're still doing it to this day. Burning people, killing people, and so they were socially deviant, as it were. They had this cult mentality, the hardcore religious folks, and then down in the South. And they kind of looked down on the people in the South who held slaves as, oh, look at that. And then down in the South, you had, Patrick Henry, who was arguably a social deviant by the standards of civilized society. Virtually all of Europe, by the time we declared independence, had banned slavery. And even though they engaged in the trade of slavery. But, slavery was, in their mind, something that was the Roman Empire used to do that. And so these guys in the South who were slaveholders were arguably social deviants. And so here you have the two major influences in early American history being basically cults that deviated from the mainstream of the culture out of which they had come. So it makes perfect sense that they would be very, very wary of any larger culture looking at them or carefully holding them up to inspection.
You don't come out and say this in your piece, but one of the things that struck me in the article that you wrote in Truthout was about the way in which the spike in gun sales here in the United States. I mean, we basically have 300 million guns out there. That's almost one for every man, woman, and child here in the country. But it seems like the spike in gun sales is related to, at some level, the changing racial demographics here in the United States. Do you find that I mean, that's how I read it in your piece, but I'm not sure if that was entered in your mind at all.
Yeah, I have three younger brothers, and one of them is a gun enthusiast. He has several guns, and whenever I go back to Michigan, we go shooting. He's got a range in his backyard, and we were in Michigan in 2009, in the spring of 2009. President Obama had just been inaugurated, and I was there for a family function, and my brother Steve said, hey, we got a couple hours, let's go down to Mason, there's a gun range, and we can rent some guns and do some target shooting. And so he and I and another one of my brothers and his son went down, and went in and I said, I went up to the counter to buy, and there's a huge gun store, big gun range, one of the biggest ones in central Michigan. And I went up to the guy and I said, I'd like to buy 200 rounds of 9mm and 200 rounds of 40mm or 40 caliber ammunition. And he said, you can have 50. And I'm like, 50? And he's like, yeah, we're rationing it. And I'm like, why are you rationing it? And he said, because it's flying off the shelves and we just don't have enough to go around. And I said, why is that? And he says, because that N-word got elected president. And then he goes off on this screed about how, Obama's going to take everybody's guns away and the blacks in the country are going to rise up. Now, this is central Michigan. But this guy, this is where the Michigan militia is based too, right?
Right.
This guy's going off on this absolute screaming racist scream. And I'm trying to refute his point, saying, wait a minute, the president never said that. Nobody ever did. And he's like, we know. And then he starts going off about those people, right? And so I think that racism is part of our DNA and something that we have not confronted in a healthy or successful way. We tried to after the Civil War, and we made a lot of progress in the 60s. And I think the presidency of President Obama is a breakthrough moment for us too, but it's still there.
Yeah, I think the Nation did run an article in August of last year called "How the Gun Industry Got Rich, Stoking Fears About Obama," and one of the things that I found interesting about the article was it talked about guns in general. At first, it says the problem with gun manufacturers is they generally make a product that's very durable, and with proper care and maintenance, it will probably last you a lifetime. So how do you get people to buy more guns? If you're like the NRA or any of the gun manufacturers who want to sell more product, they have to say somebody's going to come out there and grab your guns.
Right. And, or somebody's going to come after you who's more well armed than you are.
Exactly. There's crime, there is self-protection, but there's also this big umbrella of government that's going to come and grab your guns. And this is part of their mailers, part of the websites, part of the videos that they send out to their membership. And it's this fear mongering that's been effective in essentially smothering any kind of government's ability to curb the gun violence here in the United States. Now, Obama administration just came out with a sketch of a plan to curb gun violence. Do you have any comment on that?
I think it doesn't go anywhere near far enough. My take on what we should be doing about guns is pretty straightforward. I think, first of all, our problem with violence overall tracks back to wealth inequality. We have one of the worst cases of wealth inequality in the world. And when you look at the research that Kate Pickett and James Wilkerson have done over at the Equality Trust, equalitytrust.org.uk, he did state by state and then he did country by country over the OECD countries. But with regard to guns, I think that, in the 1920s, we discovered that these cool automobiles that we had invented and were starting to sell like hotcakes could kill people. They were starting to go fast enough. People were dying in car accidents. And so we came up with, over about a 20-year period, a fairly common sense set of rules. We started stop signs, red lights. This was nationally ratified actually in the early 1930s. We had the registration of every vehicle from the time it's manufactured until the time it's destroyed, so we know where it is, and if it gets stolen, we can track it down, and somebody has responsibility for it. Liability insurance for the vehicle or for the person, and proof of proficiency before you can drive one. 3 simple things. Why don't we do this with guns? I think that we should simply treat guns the same way we do cars because they're capable of killing people. Every gun should be registered with its serial number from the date of manufacture until the date of destruction. The owners should carry personal liability insurance, and there should be liability insurance associated with the guns. I think it's insane that those 20 kids who were killed at Newtown, had they been killed by a crazed drunk driver, right now Geico would be writing $1 million checks to every one of their families. But because they were killed by a guy with a gun, those families are SOL. They got nothing. And that's crazy. And so insurance. And number 3, proof that you know how to shoot, that you've been through some basic training in how to use and how to store and how to keep safe these weapons that are designed to kill people. So that's what I would do if I was president.
Yeah, well, agreed. I mean, I was talking with a friend of mine who was in the Marine Corps for 2 tours, and we were talking about, and he's on the right end of the political spectrum, and I'm on the left end, and we were talking about Newtown and guns, and he said that he had defriended a number of people on Facebook because of their insensitivity towards this tragedy and also ongoing gun violence. So in that, we were starting to have a bit of a dialogue about this. And I asked him at one point, I said, hey, how long was it until you actually fired a weapon in the Marine Corps? I know you had to go through training. He said, let me think. We went through gun training, and it took us 6 weeks before we actually fired off our weapon. 6 weeks. And I said, but you can walk into any Walmart and buy a .22 caliber rifle. And I know some guns, they have waiting periods, but I said there's virtually no training. And he said that there is some training that you could do over the weekend, but he said, you're right. In order for us to handle a weapon and understand, how to use it properly in the Marine Corps, it took 6 weeks, but you can get it done if you want to do any kind of training in 48 hours here outside in the civilian class, if you will. So I just found that striking.
And his experience in the military is not that dissimilar from the civilian police. I, back in the 90s, was writing a book on detectives and went through the Georgia Police Academy. In fact, I was one of the first civilians to actually go through the Georgia Police Academy. And it's the same thing with the police training, with state police training, is you learn everything about that weapon long before you pull a trigger.
Right. And I totally agree with you on the 3 recommendations, but I think gun training is the key right there, because it just seems like it's crazy. You wouldn't, like you said, you wouldn't allow somebody just to get behind a wheel without learning how to drive a car.
Well, and then there's the equivalent of seatbelts too, which is another step. But I mean, we discovered that we could make cars less dangerous by putting seatbelts and airbags in them. You can make guns easily a whole lot less dangerous by requiring that when they're sold, they have trigger locks on them. There's technology to make them more difficult to immediately access by somebody who doesn't know. The equivalent of, like the way that you lock your bike with the lock that you have the dial 3 numbers into, you can build that into a gun very easily. So you have the dial 3 numbers into it before that trigger actually can engage the firing pin. This is not rocket science. This is simple stuff that could be done.
Heck, in some apartment complexes in my area, they lock up their garbage, and you have to have a code to get into the garbage area. So, well, Thom, that's all the time that we have for on Truthout Radio. I want to thank you so much for joining us, and Thom, you're a continuing contributor to Truthout. I see your posts on there almost daily. So, congratulations on that, and thanks for contributing to the efforts that Truthout is trying to further. And again, thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure, Ted. Thanks so much to you and to the great folks at Truthout for carrying the work that we do. We're really pleased to be affiliated with Truthout.
We're happy to have you. Thom Hartmann is a nationally syndicated radio talk show host, that is, and author of numerous books and a contributor, as I said, to Truthout. And that is Truthout Radio for another week. I'm Ted Asregadoo. Thank you so much for watching.